Mark Oppenheimer is an advocate specializing in personal injury cases. He joins us via Skype now. Thanks very much for coming on to the program this evening, Mark. I know you're not directly involved in this case, but on the face of it, with the facts available to all of us, is this a winnable class action?
Well, the Consumer Protection Act provides enormous remedies to those that have suffered injuries as a result of product liabilities. So what it does is that we have a strict liability if there's a defect in a product. So ordinarily, someone would have to show that the person who's caused them harm has done so intentionally or negligently. In this case, it's strict. The question is, did you suffer the harm? Furthermore, it goes beyond just holding the producer of the product liable. What the Act does is that it extends it to producers, retailers, distributors, and importers, and all of them can be held jointly and severally liable.
That's very interesting indeed. Let's look at some of the other facts of this case. We're looking at 30 South African Ford Kuga drivers being represented in this lawsuit. But in the bigger picture, we also know the same vehicle marketed as the Ford Escape in North America gave similar problems there and led to a recall there. Given Ford's prior knowledge of this, should they have waited this long to effect a recall in South Africa?
Well, I think that'll be a question that the courts will have to decide on, to know when they had the knowledge, how much information they had. There's actually a very famous case involving Ford from the 70s, the case of the Ford Pinto. And in that case, it was shown that Ford had knowledge of a defect which led to fuel tanks exploding, and they did a cost-benefit analysis and decided that it would be cheaper to pay people out as opposed to recalling the cars and implementing. It was an $11 fix at the time. And Ford was raked through the mud, and it led to enormous reforms in consumer awareness, actually.
That's an astounding fact that you've just given us. I mean, it also emerged in this case that Ford didn't want to recall the cars as the National Consumer Commission wanted it to last week. The company now appears to have been forced to do so by the NCC. What's that going to say to a judge overseeing this case?
I think that reluctance will be a problem. But when we compute damages, it's important to realize that in America, they do things differently to the way they do here. So in America, they have a thing called punitive damages. So where a company has knowledge of a defect in a product and continues to persist in it, they can be required to pay extraordinary payouts. So one of the most famous cases is the McDonald's hot coffee case, which everyone thinks of as quite laughable. But actually what happened in that case was there were 700 complaints which weren't addressed by McDonald's, and the injuries that were sustained by the little old lady were very severe. They were third-degree burns. And in that case, the court awarded extraordinary damages to punish McDonald's. Now, we don't have that system for our dealer cases in South Africa. We do have something similar in competition law, where the courts can impose basically this additional penalty so that it doesn't happen again.
And we know Rochelle Jimmy took his vehicle in to be checked before he made a trip to the Western Cape. Ford is, of course, arguing it's not sure about the source of the fire in Jimmy's vehicle, whether it started in front or elsewhere. Is this even relevant in such a lawsuit?
Well, when you have a class action, it's important that everyone falls into the same class. So you've got to identify that everyone had the same defect and that it was caused in a similar enough manner, and that they've all suffered similar kinds of damage. So really there's two different classes we might think of here: those whose cars ignited, which is around 50 people, and then those people who haven't but have the defect in their car. So for those that haven't suffered the damage yet, it's unclear what their remedy is. So firstly, I think the best thing to do is to try and get the defect remedied through the recall process. If there is some additional loss of damage that they've suffered in the event that the car is now worth less, that's something that people must consider pursuing.
Now, in the case of a loss of life occurring, as it did in Rochelle Jimmy's case, how do you begin to determine compensation?
It's a difficult area in our law. The Act makes it clear that compensation is due in the case of a loss of life. The way that traditionally worked out is in the case of someone who is supporting a family, you work out what they would have earned for the course of their life, and then that money is then paid out to those that require the support, so either their surviving spouse or their children. However, in a situation where that person was not a breadwinner, so in the case of a child, there is no compensation that is due for their death, except for, you might think of very small amounts of money to be paid for funeral costs, or possibly the emotional shock if someone in the car witnessed their child being burnt alive. There would be some claim there for the future medical expenses to deal with the treatment, but otherwise the amounts are very small, which is quite troubling.
What would a successful class action lawsuit mean for other international companies operating in South Africa, Mark?
Well, I think it makes everyone aware that there are consequences to having faulty products, and that if Ford is held to account, that it'll ensure that others make sure that their products are safe, because they don't want to be publicly raked through the mud or to pay out large amounts. It's possible that in a matter like this, because there's only 50 people that are affected, that Ford may settle the matter as quickly as they can to avoid the PR disaster.
Mark Oppenheimer, thanks so much for giving us a legal perspective on the Ford Kuga case. Good to have you on the program tonight.